Hello there, I'm Windermere's Chief Economist, Matthew Gardner, and welcome to this month's episode of Mondays with Matthew. If you've listened to me at all over the past several years, you'll know that I am pretty passionate about one subject: housing affordability. And given the significant price growth that we've seen over the past decade, as well as the recent spike in mortgage rates, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about what might be done to address what is a very serious issue. Now, when we think about housing affordability and how it might be solved, a lot of people get tied up in the minutiae when, quite frankly, it really isn't that hard a problem to solve. You see, there's one very simple way to address this, and it's to build more housing. But as easy as that may sound, there are a lot of obstacles that are holding new supply back. But before I get to that, I want to share some data with you that might help to demonstrate how serious an issue it is that we all face. Every quarter, the National Association of Home Builders puts out its affordability numbers for metro areas across the country, and analysis of sales and incomes allows them to show the number of homes, or share of homes, both new and existing, that sold in a quarter that were affordable to households making median income. And here you'll see numbers from just a few of the 240 metros across the country, and the share of sales in the first quarter of this year that were technically affordable. And I think you'll agree, it's eye-opening. Although I'm only showing you a few of the US markets, I will tell you that the 10 least affordable US housing markets were all in California. And the Golden State is also home to 21 of the top 25 least affordable markets. But what you might also find interesting is that our primary cities aren't the only ones that are suffering from affordability issues, with markets like Bend, Oregon, Boise, Idaho, and even Las Vegas, Nevada becoming increasingly unaffordable for a lot of households. And it's also worth mentioning that 48 of the 69 markets where less than half the homes sold were affordable were in states that have, at some point in the past, implemented comprehensive planning and growth management legislation. And when governments mandate where homes can and cannot be built, one thing happens: it pushes land prices higher, which makes new homes more expensive, and also limits the amount of new supply that builders are able to provide. So, what can be done? I'll start out by saying that states who have implemented growth management plans, which they generally did to slow or stop suburban sprawl, remain disinclined to move these boundaries. And that means it becomes paramount to not look further out, but to concentrate within the urban growth boundaries and decide whether it's time to think about removing single-family zoning altogether. Now, this is a fascinating thought, but I have to add that I'm not suggesting that we do away with single-family homes. Absolutely not. What I am thinking about is the ability for a market to decide what makes the most sense. And in order to do so, single-family zones need to allow for the development of denser housing, but also allow the market to decide what is best for them. And areas that have implemented such change have given rise to a movement in order to address what's being referred to as missing middle housing. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, let me try to explain. Now, this is a great image courtesy of Optikos, and they are a team of urban designers, architects, and strategists who are all passionate about adding sorely needed housing options. And they came up with the term missing middle, as it describes housing types that were actually very common prior to World War II, when duplexes, row homes, and courtyard apartments were in high demand. Unfortunately, however, they are now far less common and therefore missing. And the key function of this type of housing is to meet the rising demand for walkable neighborhoods, respond to changing demographics, as well as to provide housing at different price points. Now, you see, rather than focusing on the number of units in a structure, and you think about high-rise apartments or condominiums. Well, this type of housing emphasizes scale and height that are both appropriate for and sympathetic to single-family or transitional neighborhoods. And to show you how supply of these types of units has changed, this chart shows the number of duplexes to 8-unit buildings built over the past almost half century. And you can clearly see that up until the late 1980s, they were actually being built in decent numbers. But the decade of the 90s saw a significant shift towards single-family traditional home ownership, and builders followed the demand, and this type of product started to become scarcer. Almost 16% of total new homes built in America in the early 1980s were of this style, but that number now has shrunk to just 1.4%, or a paltry 19,000 units. But I see demand for these housing types growing as we move forward, and that buyers or renters, both young and old, will be attracted as it meets their requirements not only in regards to the type of home that they want to live in, but more importantly, it can be built cheaper than traditional single-family housing, and therefore it will be more affordable. But although this sounds like it's a remarkably simple solution that can solve all of our woes, in reality, it's not that easy for two specific reasons. The first is that many markets are already essentially built out, meaning that in order to develop this type of product, a builder would have to purchase a number of existing homes and raise them in order to rebuild. But given current home values, well, it makes it very hard for a builder to be able to make such a proposal pencil financially. And the second issue is that current residents within these transition areas, which have been developed as normal single-family neighborhoods, well, they simply don't want to see change. But is this type of product bad? Let's look at some examples. Now, this shows row homes in Brooklyn on the left and traditional triple-deckers in Massachusetts on the right. This is a bungalow court project in California. Here are some live-work units in Colorado, and here are some amazing Muse homes in Utah. And finally, a new terrace housing project that will be built in Washington, D.C. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure that there are some of you who simply aren't inspired by this type of architecture, and that is more than understandable. But can we really simply stick with the status quo? I don't think so. And some state legislators agree and have already implemented significant amendments to zoning in order to try and encourage these types of development forms. Back in 2018, Minneapolis was the first city to allow this type of development inside single-family zoned areas, and this was then followed by the state of Oregon in 2019. And even in California, where Governor Newsom signed Senate Bill 9 into law last year, which made it legal for property owners to subdivide lots into 2 parcels and turn single-family homes into duplexes. And this actually effectively legalized 4plexes on land previously reserved for single-family homes. So we are starting to see some change. And this is a good start, but as I mentioned earlier, in markets which are already essentially built out, even this type of forward-thinking legislation will not be the panacea that some want. But I'm not giving up hope. Addressing the missing middle would allow for homes of all shapes and sizes, for people of all incomes, including workers who are essential to our economies and our communities. And here I'm talking about our teachers, firefighters, administrative assistants, childcare providers, and nurses, just to name a few. There are currently 45 million Americans aged between 25 and 34, and most aspire to home ownership. However, the massive price growth, which, by the way, many of us have benefited from over the past several years, has simply put a starter home out of their reach. Now, I'll leave you with one last statistic. Over 28% of American households today are made up of single people living alone. And it's anticipated that up to 85% of all US households will not include children by the year 2025. And finally, by 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. Are we going to meet the needs of the country's changing demographic going forward? I certainly hope so, but it will take a lot of work for us to get there. As always, if you have any questions or comments about this particular topic, please do reach out to me. But in the meantime, stay safe out there. I look forward to visiting with you all again next month. Bye now.